1906, the San Francisco earthquake. The city crumbles and burns. 3 years later, San Francisco is back on its feet and ready to prove it to the world. President Taft travels to the West Coast and predicts the completion of the Panama Canal in 6 years. San Francisco Mayor James Rolfe Jr. and the Blue Ribbon panel of merchants and industrialists propose an exposition in honor of the completion of the canal. The Panama Pacific International Exposition of 1915.
The Panama Pacific International Exposition of 1915 celebrated the completion of the Panama Canal. But it was really one of a long series of international expositions which began in London in 1851 with the Crystal Palace. These expositions occurred because mass producers were seeking mass markets for their goods, and they were, in a sense, giant trade fairs. But they became more than that because the competitors, the nations, in the United States, the various states, began to compete with each other and build bigger and bigger expositions, bigger and bigger buildings. In fact, most expositions lost a lot of money. This particular one was one of the very few that did not lose money. The design of this fair is particularly interesting. Early fairs took place in one huge building. The Crystal Palace, for example, was one great big glass palace, and there was a Crystal Palace in New York. But as the fairs got bigger and bigger, so the number of buildings began to proliferate. And perhaps the most famous American fair was the Chicago Fair of 1893, which was built in Jackson Park and was known as the White City. And everything was gleaming, dazzling, in fact, even blindingly white. But for this fair, the people organizing the fair hired a color coordinator. And the idea was to make the whole fair into a harmonious color sort of symphony. The walls were all done in pastel colors, terracottas and lime greens and pale blues. The fair was laid out so that there were a number of protected courts. There's one there, another there, the main one in the middle. And these kept the wind and cold fog from getting into the exhibition. It was a very ingenious design. In the center was the main tower, which was called the Tower of Jewels. Nearly all these expositions had huge towers. The most famous, of course, is the Eiffel Tower in Paris, which was built for the Exposition of 1889. This Tower of Jewels was 450 feet high. Now that's higher than Nob Hill. It's very, very high. The arches underneath were each higher than the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. The tower was covered with more than 100,000 glass jewels, which were made in Bohemia, which is, of course, now part of Czechoslovakia. Each jewel was hand-polished and faceted, and behind it, as you can see, there was a little mirror so that it reflected, so that the whole tower sparkled in the daytime. At night, the whole fair was illuminated by indirect lighting, and this was also an innovation because previously fairs had been lighted by outlining the buildings in electric light bulbs, the way you sometimes see on old movie houses. But here there were all hidden searchlights. On top of that, out in the bay, as you can see here, was something called the scintillator. The scintillator was a battery of 48 searchlights manned by a squad of Marines who changed the filters in front of the searchlights so that they would shine different colors. When these lights shone upon the fog, it really looked very strange and wonderful. But on evenings when there wasn't fog, they had stationed out there a locomotive, painted marble color, which they charged up, and so it would produce huge clouds of steam, and then these clouds of colored steam would drift over the whole fairgrounds. The lights also, of course, shone on the Tower of Jewels and made it a sparkle. Now, one of the things about a fair, any fair, is that the various competitors, whether they be companies or cities or states or nations, have to decide how they're going to represent themselves. They've got a limited budget. They've only got one building usually to do it. So they have to decide how they're going to present themselves. Are they going to show themselves in some sort of traditional way? Are they going to show themselves as a modern, progressive nation? Here you can see some examples of it. The biggest building is the California building, and it was done in the mission style, but far bigger than any mission that was ever built in California. It stood at the head of an avenue of states, and the various buildings, state buildings, were often in styles that we associate with the states. Virginia had Mount Vernon. Massachusetts had the State House with a gold dome. Some states who weren't lucky enough to have a famous building simply built sort of a Greek palace. Oregon, for example, built the Parthenon, made entirely out of wood with 48 columns of Douglas fir with a bark left on. In the same way, the nations also built various buildings in their various national styles. Germany and Britain decided not to bring buildings as they were having a war, but France built the Palace of the Legion of Honor, which was later reconstructed, entirely reconstructed, and is now at the Art Museum up in Lincoln Park. The fair covered 635 acres. It was really very, very big. It went all the way from Van Ness Avenue, which we can't quite see in the picture, to the Presidio. You can see this racetrack over here is now where Cressy Field is. From here, this street here is Chestnut Street, and it went from Chestnut Street to the Bay. And of course, what's there now is the marina and a whole housing development. But there is one building which remains, and that is the Palace of Fine Arts.
The Palace of Fine Arts was actually the Exposition's art gallery. Now, every great exposition had an art gallery. It was usually paired with the Palace of Machinery, which in this case was a mile east over by Fort Mason. The Palace of Fine Arts was considered to be the plum of the exposition as far as commission went for the architect. It was the greatest honor that an architect could have. In this case, it was given to Willis Polk, who was the city's best known, or certainly the most self-advertising of all of the city's architects at that time. Polk designed a building for the site that was a pretty dull thing. It was a big classical structure with a lot of columns and a big dome on it. Polk wasn't particularly happy with this. He was also very busy at the time, so he decided that he was going to go up to the Bohemian Grove for a weekend and think about it. And meanwhile, he had a competition among all the office workers, the draftsmen, in his office to try to come up with a better design for it. When he came back on Monday, there were a number of designs. One of them was totally outstanding. He liked it very much, and he presented it with all of the other drawings that had been done by the draftsmen in the office to the other architects of the fair, and they all chose this one drawing. Now, that drawing was by a man named Bernard Maybeck, who at that time was 50 years old, hadn't really designed very much, and wasn't very well known. But Polk, in a very unusual and magnanimous gesture for Polk, decided to step aside and give the commission for the Palace of Fine Arts to Maybeck. Maybeck was about 50 years old in 1912 when he was selected to design this building, and it was a very big step in Maybeck's career because before this he had largely designed small craftsman brown shingle houses in Marin and in Berkeley, but this one particular building immediately gave him international fame. Now, Maybeck had gone to the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, which was the premier architecture school in the world at that time. The École des Beaux-Arts taught all the principles of classical architecture and a great respect for the past. Maybeck picked up on that. He had great respect for the École itself, but he always took those principles of classical architecture, as in the Palace of Fine Arts, and warped and twisted them in ways that were extremely individualistic and altogether his own. What he was trying to do in the Palace of Fine Arts was to create what he said was a feeling of sadness modified by the feeling that beauty has a soothing influence, and I think the palace does that very well. He wanted to do that because he felt that art itself was a very sad experience, and of course the building was filled with art. Now, he felt that art was a sad experience because art is the way by which humans try to reach perfection. And we never can reach perfection, and the artist knows that, and in a sense the viewer knows that. Everybody wanted to know where Maybach had gotten his ideas from, and he really didn't give much away. He said that it was inspired by a 19th century romantic German painting by a man named Arnold Böcklin called The Isle of the Dead. Well, that's a very melancholic painting, but there's nothing in it that looks anything like the palace. Another place that he got his ideas from, I think, was the 18th century engraver Piranesi, who was very, very well known at that time, especially among architects. Now, Piranesi was famous for doing these extremely visionary and very romantic depictions of great Roman ruins. He made them much, much larger than they actually were, and they were all covered with vines and trees and everything, and I think that's really where Maybach got a lot of his ideas from. As you look across the lagoon, it actually looks like the Palace of Fine Arts is one building, but in reality it's three quite separate parts. There's the shed, which is the curved structure behind, which is the utilitarian structure. That's the part that had the paintings in it. There's the colonnade, which wraps around the rotunda. And there's the rotunda itself, which is the enormous domed building right in the center on that small island. The rotunda is about as tall as an 18-story building. It gives you a sense of sort of overwhelming grandeur. The figures up at the top, those figures of men, are actually 22 feet tall, though it's very difficult to get a sense of scale. Originally, the shed itself was used for the paintings, but the rest of the building was used as an enormous exterior sculpture garden, and there were sculptures all through the palace, equestrian statues, standing statues, and particularly the most popular were the little duck babies, the little statues of elves and gremlins and everything, which people loved very much. They were all on the exterior of the building, and then up under the roof of the rotunda there were enormous murals. There were the 4 golds of California, for example, which were poppies, wheat, oranges, and gold itself. Everybody wonders about the enormous ladies up on the top of the colonnade with their backs turned towards you in a very unclassical way. There's nothing else quite like them anywhere else. Those ladies are looking into enormous caskets, and they actually increase the sense of mystery of the building because you're supposed to wonder what they're looking at. One of the wonderful things about the palace is that it's not like most classical buildings that we're used to. It's not white or gray like a lot of the buildings in Washington, D.C. or in downtown San Francisco. It's richly colored. It's kind of in ochres, tans, and reds. Now, originally it was even much more colorful than this. Originally the palace was painted over, and so that the shed itself was painted Pompeian red. The columns were in tones of gold and in green. The capitals, the tops of the columns, were in gold, and the boxes were painted to look like malachite. All of these kinds of colors, which in many ways detracted from the structure of the building because they were rather garish, faded away over the years and left it in these kinds of sunset bleach tones of ochre and rust. And I think in many ways this is much preferable to the way that it was originally.
I'm very distressed at the way it's reproduced in the small map that they have, because it was so much more beautiful. To begin with, the building itself was behind a great walk, and the colonnades, which bordered on the lagoon there, with these columns, were all filled with shrubbery and trees and things, and the sculpture was exhibited outdoors. And it made it very beautiful, and it's the way sculpture should be, you know. It'll be used among shrubbery. It shouldn't stand out like a sore finger.
Fabulous.
Well, it was one of the
most wonderful
greatest things building-wise in this country at that time.
I was 17, 18, and 19, and I went to the fair because my father had charge of the sculpture at the fair, and so the whole family came west.
Well, I went there because I was going to art school, and I was quite interested in the European Impressionist painters.
I was 8 years old, and I lived on 51st Street in Oakland. I was born there, and this was the country in those days. And when we went to the fair, that was the most exciting thing I'd ever been to.
Well, that was the first time we saw that type of work, because At that time, there wasn't many magazines, art magazines, that showed that only one called a Studio that had color shots.
You know, you couldn't even buy a completely manufactured radio until, in the early 20s.
It took 4 days to cross the continent, and of course you could send a telegram, but even it took time.
For the first couple
were
of years,
thinking.
the first couple of years of the war, this country wasn't greatly concerned. We didn't get into it till, as you remember, 1917.
World War I had started, and so there was a lot of talk about whether we should get into it or whether we should not get into it. And California was pretty far away, and we didn't really bother ourselves very much about it.
It didn't hit home, really, until our boys began to go over there and land in France.
My father wrote something at that time, which indicates the hopefulness and the spirit of going forward and into a bright future that he felt and that we all felt at that time. Sometimes I think it's lacking now, but anyhow, here is what he said. Sculpture reflects, in choice of subject and treatment, the spirit of our time. It is ugly because our age is ugly, the gasoline age of noise and stink. We cannot go back to the golden age that produced the Venus of Cyrene, but we must and will go forward and find a new way of life when the emphasis is put on the things that really matter. The world is groping for it, and perhaps sculpture can help by creating gracious images of truth, beauty, with all the hate, greed, and envy left out. And that was the way we hoped the world would be.
When the fair closed, it was a very moving ceremony. Thousands of people came. There were speeches, of course, and gradually in the evening the lights were turned out one by one, and people wandered around through the gardens all night long, many people in tears. In fact, one old couple fainted. They had been to the fair nearly every day, and they were so overcome with emotion that they had to be carried away. But perhaps one of the most amazing things about that was that though the fair was left open all night and people wandered around, there was no damage. People did not tear up things, they didn't tear up the plants, they didn't damage the buildings. Before the fair ended, many people wanted to try and preserve the whole thing. It was so beautiful and so many people were moved by it. But of course it was not built in materials which were meant to last. And not only that, but the ground itself had only been leased and was supposed to be returned to its original owners. Nevertheless, there were great attempts to preserve the various buildings. The only one that was preserved was the Palace of Fine Arts. So at the end of the fair, the Palace of Fine Arts was preserved, or rather, it wasn't torn down. It was left to sit there. But it gradually deteriorated. Bits of it fell off, it got waterlogged, it got overgrown, perhaps in the way that Maybeck would have liked. But finally, it was in such a state that it was a danger. In fact, it was fenced off at one point so that you couldn't get very close to it. And then the people of San Francisco finally got together, raised enough money to try and restore it.
When the reconstruction of the Palace of Fine Arts was promoted by many citizens in San Francisco, Bill Merchant, for whom I had been working, was amongst those who were not only interested, but who had also been actively involved in it before, including the original construction of the palace. He was a draftsman for Maybeck. My own involvement came because I became a member of Bill Merchant's firm in 1949, and our actual work on the palace started in approximately 1958. It was about 1961, after we were well into the project, that Bill Merchant died, and I took over the office and the reconstruction of the palace. The bids came in 1963, and we estimated that it would take approximately 3 years to rebuild this project, which is what actually happened. The original estimate was $6 million, and the bid, when it came in from contractors, was approximately $7 million. So at that point, additional money had to be found. In addition to that, the city would have liked to reconstruct the entire main building with all its ornamentation, and if that had been done, the bids showed that it would have been about $25 million. So it was immediately limited to the most important thing. Amongst the things that were not reconstructed were the murals on the rotunda ceiling. These murals were originally installed during the Exposition, and during the WPA days, new ones were made, and they were rather ugly and uninteresting and bland murals. They could have been replaced by doing a lot of repair work on it, but the money wasn't really there, and I'm just as glad that it wasn't. The original also had a great deal of color on it, which I had never seen except on illustrations, and it looked very garish, gaudy, and I think it might have been suitable for an exposition building, but not for a permanent building and monument like the Palace of Fine Arts is now. My own feeling was that in 20 years after the building was reconstructed, it would again be dirty, it would again have the kind of ruin, the atmosphere of a ruin, which it did at the time it was torn down. In actual fact, very soon after the building was reconstructed, there were many people who didn't even realize that it was a new building.
The Palace of Fine Arts, a testimony to San Francisco's recovery from a devastating earthquake, a reminder of people and values of another era, and a statement of our desire and ability to integrate the past with the present. The Palace of Fine Arts, a landmark of the city.